At the turn of the 20th century, the great powers were already aware of the danger posed by chemical weapons. As early as the Hague Peace Conference of 1899, a declaration was adopted prohibiting the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. The civilized world considered poisoning the enemy inhumane, a barbaric method of warfare. Despite this, scientific and technological progress tempted generals. How could chemistry be used to break the stalemate of war? At the start of the First World War, both sides experimented with non-lethal irritant substances. In August 1914, the French used tear gas in grenades against the Germans for the first time, ethyl bromoacetate, but only in small quantities. The enemy hardly noticed these attacks. In the autumn of 1914, Germany also tested chemicals. During the fighting at Neuve-Chapelle, German artillery fired 3,000 shells filled with an irritant, diazidine chloride. However, the explosive destroyed the chemical, and the British did not realize they had been attacked with gas. Such actions did not formally violate the Hague Declaration, since the gas was not the sole object of the shells, but was dispersed together with the explosion. No one yet dared to cross the line and use poisonous gases on a large scale until the war had bogged down into trench stalemate. In the German Empire, there was one man ready to cross that line. The eminent chemist Fritz Haber headed the program to create chemical weapons, seeing in it a chance to break out of positional deadlock. He believed that in peacetime a scientist belongs to peace, but in wartime he belongs to his country. And if victory required putting science into action, then that was what had to be done. Haber personally supervised the development of battle poisons, led the chemical section of the German War Ministry, and secured permission to use gases on the battlefield. Not everyone shared his enthusiasm. His own wife, Clara Immerwahr, also a chemist by training, called the creation of poisonous gases a perversion of the ideals of science and an act of barbarism, saying it corrupts the very essence of science, which should bring new knowledge of life. For her, her husband's work became a personal tragedy. After the first battlefield use of chlorine, she took her own life, shooting herself in the heart with her husband's pistol. But this didn't stop Haber. The next morning after her death, he left for the Eastern Front to prepare a new gas attack. War consumed morality and science, all for the phantom of victory. First experiments on the Eastern Front, the poisoned shells of Bolimov. The first testing ground for chemical warfare was the Eastern Front. The German command decided to test poisonous gas against the Imperial Russian Army in the winter of 1915. On January 31, 1915, near the town of Bolimov, now in Poland, the Germans carried out a massive chemical bombardment. They fired 18,000 artillery shells filled with liquid xylyl bromide, a powerful tear gas, at the positions of the Russian Second Army. It was the first large-scale gas attack in history. However, the results were far from what was expected. The temperatures were freezing, and the chemical did not vaporize. The poisonous liquid simply froze and fell to the ground as a harmless residue. The Russian soldiers escaped with little more than a fright. The next day, they even launched a counterattack in that sector. The Germans, meanwhile, received a disturbing warning. Part of the toxic vapor was blown back toward their own lines, and about 1,000 German soldiers suffered from their own gas. Unsurprisingly, the attack had no offensive effect. It only added another layer of horror to an already bloody slaughter. The failure at Bolimov did not stop the advocates of chemical weapons. Less than a month later, on March 22, 1915, another gas attack was carried out against Russian positions, this time near the Ravka River, and again it failed. The wind shifted, and the gas once more drifted back over the German trenches. Nevertheless, the German command insisted. What was needed was scale and a stronger poison. While plans were being developed on the Western Front, preparations for revenge were underway in the East as well. In May 1915, the Germans brought a new chemical weapon to the Bolimov sector, cylinders filled with chlorine gas. the 36th Pioneer Regiment delivered 12,000 metal cylinders containing liquid chlorine mixed with phosgene. They were arranged along a 12-kilometer stretch of the front, guarded by infantry preparing for a breakthrough. The operation was postponed several times, awaiting favorable winds. Finally, at dawn on May 31, 1915, at 3:45 a.m., the code word came through the telephone: Wittelsbach. German engineers simultaneously opened the valves of the cylinders. The morning silence exploded with hissing. A thick green cloud rolled toward the Russian trenches. At the same time, German artillery opened fire, and under the cover of the poisonous fog, infantry battalions charged forward. The attack unfolded with horrifying efficiency. At first, the chlorine did its dark work. The forward Russian trenches filled with choking men. Witnesses recalled that the gas, being heavier than air, crawled along the ground, seeping into trenches and shelters, creeping even into dugouts. Those who remained standing on the parapets had a better chance than the wounded lying on the ground. The gas cloud suffocated those closest to the earth first. Russian soldiers, unaware of any means of protection, fled wherever they could, or, in agony, clutched at their throats. Entire units were annihilated or scattered in terror. Thousands died a terrible death from chlorine poisoning. According to German data, the Russians lost around 9,000 men in this gas attack on the Ravka front, more than 1,000 of them killed. Yet, as it turned out, even such losses did not guarantee victory. Despite multiple breakthroughs, the Germans failed to completely break the defense. The Russian command quickly brought up reserves, and fierce fighting erupted amid the suffocating gas. Over the course of a day, the Germans launched 9 assaults, but met ferocious resistance from the desperate remnants of regiments and newly arrived reinforcements. Even though some Russian units lost up to 75% of their men, the front held. The Germans had cracked the defense, but not destroyed it. The gas strike alone was not enough. Soldiers and bayonet attacks were still needed, and that became a problem. The Bolimov operation ended with only minor territorial gains for the Germans. Chlorine poisoned thousands, but it brought no decisive success. The consequences for the Russian army, however, were horrific. Thousands of soldiers died in agony, and thousands more were left crippled, with scorched lungs, chemical burns to the eyes and skin. The survivors were morally shattered. For the first time in history, they had faced an invisible, insidious weapon against which a rifle was useless. The shock of the gas massacre on the Ravka forced the Russian command to reconsider. Soon, the Army's Artillery Directorate created a special commission to study chemical warfare and develop its own gas shells. The chemical arms race was now gathering momentum on both sides of the front. Meanwhile, another chilling episode of the gas war unfolded in the East, the attack of the dead men. On August 6, 1915, the Germans attempted to storm the Osowiec fortress in northeastern Poland. After several failed frontal assaults, the German command decided to humble the impregnable fortress with chlorine. Early that morning, waiting for a favorable wind, the Germans released a thick cloud of poison gas over Osowiec's defenses. The garrison, about 500 men of the 226th Infantry Regiment, had no gas masks and could only press wet rags to their faces. Chlorine seeped everywhere, mowing down men. The German infantry, 14 battalions under the command of Field Marshal Hindenburg himself, advanced, expecting an easy victory. Then the incredible happened. When the Germans approached the fortifications, ghostly figures began to crawl out of the poisoned smoke to meet them. A few dozen Russian soldiers, the only ones who had survived the gas inferno, rose in a counterattack. They staggered forward, wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, coughing up pieces of their own lungs, their faces swollen and burned. They were almost dead, but still they fired their rifles and charged with bayonets. The German attackers were seized with panic. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled from this horrifying sight. It seemed as if the dead themselves had risen to take revenge. The assault collapsed. A few hundred living corpses, forced several thousand enemy troops into retreat. This episode entered history as the Attack of the Dead Men, a terrifying symbol of both the endurance of the human spirit and the demonic nature of chemical warfare. In the end, the Russians abandoned Osowiec a few weeks later when the front was outflanked, but the Germans never managed to capture the fortress ruins by storm. The Eastern Front was the first to witness the fog of death in action, but chemical weapons gained worldwide notoriety elsewhere, on the fields of Flanders in the spring of 1915. It was there that poison gas was first used on a truly massive scale, changing the nature of war forever. The Poisonous Mist at Ypres, 1915. April 22, 1915, Western Front, Belgium. The battlefield near Ypres, around the village of Langemarck, lay quiet. Earlier that day, another artillery barrage had fallen silent. The Allied troops, French units including colonial regiments from Algeria, and British-Canadian battalions waited tensely to see what would come next. Suddenly, from the German lines, a strange haze began to creep forward, quickly swelling into a broad cloud. It was gray-green in color and carried the sharp smell of chlorine. A light breeze blew from the German side, and the cloud drifted straight toward the Allied trenches. Within minutes, the creeping wall of vapor engulfed the entire 4-mile defensive line. Soldiers in the trenches began to cough and clutch at their throats. The gas invaded their lungs, causing searing pain. Anyone who took even a single deep breath drowned almost instantly in their own froth. The French and Algerian troops holding the front were struck by shock. No one knew what to do. Humanity had never before faced a poisonous gas attack of such power. The first instinct was to flee from the deadly smoke. Eyewitnesses described a nightmarish scene. From the yellow-green fog burst out soldiers throwing down their weapons, tearing off their gear. They ran like madmen in all directions, choking, spitting blood, wrote French Colonel Mordoc of the 45th Division, which had been caught in the gas zone. Men who moments earlier had been sitting in trenches now fled aimlessly to the rear, desperate to escape, with eyes wide open, clutching their throats. Some fell where they stood and never got up again. Dusk was falling when that strange green cloud of death rose from the German trenches before the French positions. In an instant, death had them by the throat. They cannot be blamed for breaking and running. In the darkness of that terrible night, they writhed in agony, ran blindly through the gas cloud, and fell, their chests bursting, foam on their lips from slow suffocation, later recalled British officer Alfred Pollard. About 1,100 men died within minutes, choking on chlorine. Another 7,000 suffered severe poisoning. The Allied defensive line simply ceased to exist. A gaping hole 6 to 7 kilometers wide had opened in the front. Thus took place the world's first successful chemical attack, the gas assault at Ypres, a battle that would go down in history as the Second Battle of Ypres. The Germans had concentrated 5,730 cylinders of liquid chlorine, about 167 tons of poison, against the Allied lines. They knew the enemy had no means of protection and expected that this fog of death would shatter the front. And indeed, it worked. The French divisions were thrown into disarray and virtually destroyed within a few hours. In panic, they abandoned their guns and artillery as the infantry retreated in chaos. For the first time since 1914, it seemed that the static front had finally moved. Yet the German command failed to fully exploit its diabolical success. Perhaps they had not expected such a devastating effect. Their infantry advanced late and cautiously, fearing their own gas. Moreover, not enough reserves were brought forward to exploit the breakthrough. As the Germans slowly moved through the deserted trenches near the villages of Langemarck and Pilkum, the Allies had already begun to recover. On the flanks of the gap, Canadian units of the British Army held firm. They did not flee and instead stood their ground, covering the retreating French. It was the Canadians who first grasped the nature of the gas. Chlorine smelled like bleach in drinking water. A volunteer chemist among them advised a quick, improvised defense. Soldiers were ordered to soak their handkerchiefs and press them to their faces, breathing through the wet cloth. It was believed that adding a bit of baking soda to the water or even using one's own urine helped, as ammonia and urea partially neutralized the chlorine. This crude method genuinely saved many lives. The Canadian battalions, holding damp rags over their mouths, managed to endure for several hours and prevented the Germans from seizing Ypres without a fight. The German infantry, confused and having inhaled some of the poison themselves, failed to advance decisively. By evening, Allied commanders hurriedly plugged the gap with reserves. British and French reinforcements re-established the front right up to the outskirts of Ypres. The Germans repeated the gas attack 2 days later, on April 24, 1915, this time against Canadian positions near the village of St. Julien. Again, a yellowish poisonous cloud rolled forward. The Canadians stood their ground, firing through the haze, but were eventually forced to retreat with heavy losses. On May 2nd, the Germans released gas against the British near Mousetrap Farm, and on May 5th they attacked Hill 60 with chlorine. On that hill, the toxic mist lingered especially long. Greenish fumes hung over the trenches, seeping into every crevice. The British official report stated that 90 soldiers suffocated in the trenches, while 207 more, severely poisoned, barely reached the aid stations. 58 of them later died of asphyxiation. When the Second Battle of Ypres ended on May 25, 1915, the territorial gains for Germany were meager, a small bulge in the front line. But the psychological and strategic impact was enormous. Poison gas had entered the arsenal of modern war. The losses among the Allies from the German gas attacks at Ypres were horrific. In just under 5 weeks of fighting, about 15,000 Allied soldiers suffered gas injuries, of whom up to 5,000 died in excruciating agony. Hundreds of square kilometers of Flanders fields were contaminated with chlorine. The grass had turned yellow, and animal carcasses covered the ground. The world was shocked by the photographs. Soldiers in strange masks and bandages patrolling deserted trenches, clouds of smoke drifting above the lines, rows of dead men with faces blackened by poison. The Ypres gas attack horrified the international community. British and French newspapers condemned Germany's actions as bloody barbarism and a flagrant violation of the Hague Conventions. The Allied governments officially declared that the German Empire had committed a war crime by using a banned weapon of mass destruction. The Germans responded cynically that they had not technically broken the law. The Hague Declaration of 1899 mentioned only the prohibition of chemical shells, not gas released from cylinders. Such legal sophistry offered little comfort to the soldiers who had died choking on chlorine. The Great War had descended yet another step deeper into the abyss of barbarism. A new era had begun, the era of chemical warfare. Escalation, Phosgene, and the improvement of chemical death. The gas attack at Ypres forced the Allies to rethink their approach. Whereas Britain had at first rejected the use of poison on moral grounds, the events of April 1915 pushed those doubts aside. It is a cowardly form of warfare which is repugnant to me, as it is to other English officers, but we shall not win this war unless we kill or incapacitate more of the enemy than they do of us, and if that requires imitating the enemy in the choice of weapons, we must not refuse, declared British General Charles Ferguson after Ypres. In other words, the Allies decided to answer in kind. In May 1915, the British Army created a special chemical service, the Special Companies of the Royal Engineers under Major Fawkes. A military chemical laboratory was opened near Saint-Omer in northern France, where poisonous substances were experimented with and methods of gas employment developed. The French, having suffered terrible losses at Ypres, also ramped up chlorine production. In addition, the first primitive protective devices, more on them later, were hurriedly sent to the front. Thus, Germany's chemical advantage proved short-lived. The chemical arms race had begun. The Allies' first large-scale gas attack came at the Battle of Loos in the autumn of 1915. On 25 September 1915, the British Army in northern France went over to the offensive after first releasing a cloud of chlorine from their trenches, just as the Germans had at Ypres. The British had prepared 5,100 cylinders of chlorine, about 140 tons of gas. But they were bitterly disappointed. The wind proved an untrustworthy ally. Unlike in Flanders, gusts and eddies formed around Loos and the gas lay in an uneven layer. In places, the chlorine even blew back. The poisonous cloud crawled toward the British trenches. Engineers had warned this could happen, but command insisted on launching the attack. To make matters worse, the keys to some cylinders were missing. Some bottles remained sealed and later, in the heat of battle, were struck by German shells, poisoning the British even more. The protective masks issued to British soldiers were very primitive. Fabric hoods made men suffocate and fogged up so badly that nothing could be seen. In panic, some soldiers tore off their masks and immediately received a lethal dose of gas. As a result, at Loos, the feared outcome occurred. The British suffered from gas almost as much as the Germans. Their chlorine only killed a few Germans, while 2,632 British soldiers were poisoned. Only 7 of them died directly from gas. The rest were saved, though many remained disabled. The British offensive bogged down amid terrible casualties. In total, over 60,000 British were killed and wounded at Loos. Gas did not bring a decisive advantage. On the contrary, it added chaos to the assault. But the Allies learned from this gas failure. Thereafter, they significantly improved both chemical weapons and defensive equipment. The main lesson: do not rely on the wind. Deliver gas to the enemy by artillery. Meanwhile, German chemists were not idle. The shortcomings of chlorine became obvious. It had a strong smell and color, so it was easy to detect. Moreover, its action was often insufficiently lethal. With elementary protection, a wet cloth, soldiers could survive a chlorine attack. A new, much more toxic poison was needed. It appeared at the end of 1915. Phosgene, a colorless gas with almost no odor, a faint smell of rotten hay, proved a true killer. It is roughly 6 times more toxic than chlorine. Hidden in ordinary air, phosgene initially caused little irritation. Soldiers might not even realize they had been poisoned. But after several hours, the lungs of the affected filled with fluid and the victim slowly suffocated from pulmonary edema. Death from phosgene often resembled drowning on land, only stretched over a day. This terrible substance was developed by a group of French chemists under Victor Grignard and by some accounts was first used by the French at the end of 1915. But phosgene gained real notoriety through German use, and primarily on the Western Front. On 19 December 1915, the German army carried out the first combined gas attack near Ypres, the area of Wilste. A mixture of chlorine and phosgene was released from cylinders toward British trenches. British soldiers, now equipped with gas hoods, the so-called R helmets, suffered heavy casualties. 1,069 men were affected, 69 of them died. Phosgene proved its lethality. Most of the casualties did not die immediately, but the next day, after the battle, having at first believed themselves well until their lungs failed. It was now clear that phosgene was deadlier than chlorine. Its drawback, delayed action, was simultaneously an advantage. An enemy army could suffer delayed losses after the battle. From then on, the Germans generously added phosgene to their gas attacks. They did not use the pure gas, but a special liquid form, diphosgene, the codename Green Cross. Initially, it was less toxic than pure phosgene and evaporated less readily, but it was safer to manufacture and more convenient for filling shells. Later, the Allied countries also established phosgene production. It was added to chlorine. The British marking called this mixture White Cross, or used on its own. By the end of the war, phosgene had become the greatest killer among all chemical agents. It accounted for roughly 85% of all chemical fatalities in the First World War. Overall, between 1915 and 1918, about 36,600 tons of phosgene were produced. Germany, about 18,100 tons, France, 15,700 tons, Britain and the U.S. about 1,400 tons each. Chlorine production was also measured in tens of thousands of tons. The industries of the warring nations ran at full capacity to fill cylinders and shells. By the war's end, chlorine remained the most widely used agent, nearly 93,800 tons produced by the belligerents, with phosgene in second place. Chemical warfare spread to every front. Chemical gas was first used in Europe on June 29, 1916, when German and Austro-Hungarian troops used it against Italian forces on the Isonzo front. In response, the Italian army began forming chemical defense units and ordering gas masks from the Allies. Earlier, in 1915, the Austro-Hungarian army had also used chlorine on the Eastern Front against Russian forces. While Russia tried to respond with gas in kind in 1916, it had very little effect. By the end of the war, every major power possessed chemical weapons. Yet the world had still not seen the most terrifying gas of all, a weapon that would surpass everything that came before. Germany had saved this trump card for 1917. Mustard gas was unleashed. On June 27, 1917, British soldiers on the Western Front noticed strange German shells bursting in no man's land. Instead of bright explosions, they left behind small clouds of yellowish smoke and a sharp odor, something like garlic or rotting vegetation. At first, no one paid much attention to these duds, but within days, troops began to develop unusual symptoms. Eyes turned red and painfully inflamed, often leading to temporary blindness. Terrible blisters appeared on the skin, especially in moist areas under clothing, bursting and refusing to heal. Nausea, coughing, and extreme weakness followed. Dozens of British soldiers were incapacitated, but curiously with no visible wounds, no shrapnel. Only later did medics realize this was a new poisonous substance, one that did not kill instantly, but slowly ate away at a person from the outside and within. Soil samples revealed an oily yellow-brown liquid, mustard gas. Mustard gas, dichlorothelly sulfide, took its name from its odor, reminiscent of mustard, sometimes garlic, sometimes burnt rubber. It was first used by the German army on July 12, 1917, during shelling of Allied positions near Ypres. The Germans marked the shells with a yellow cross, hence the codename Gelbkreuz. British soldiers nicknamed it Hun stuff, while the French called it Ypres, after the city of Ypres where it first appeared. Despite being called a gas, it was in fact a liquid aerosol dispersed in tiny droplets upon shell detonation, seeping into the ground and equipment. Mustard gas was not primarily designed to kill, but to incapacitate and terrorize. It attacked skin, eyes, and lungs, and contaminated everything it touched: clothing, trenches, soil. Even minor wounds became infected when exposed to it. Low concentrations could still cause severe, lasting injuries. The substance lingered for days or even months, especially in cold, damp weather, turning entire sectors of the front into death zones, where movement without protection was impossible. The goal of mustard gas was not immediate death, but chaos. Soldiers poisoned by it often could not fight, yet did not die quickly. They needed evacuation, care, and resources. Within just 3 weeks of its introduction in the summer of 1917, Allied gas casualties equaled those from all gas attacks in the previous year. Its effectiveness was devastating. In one of the first mustard gas assaults, July 1917, the Allies suffered over 2,100 casualties. Hospitals overflowed with burned and blinded men. "We cannot dress them or even touch them. Their burns are too painful," wrote one British nurse. "We cover them with tented sheets. The pain must be unimaginable. Ordinary wounded men lie quietly, but the gassed ones scream, unable to bear it." Doctors described victims whose skin turned dark brown, leaving pale outlines where watches or straps had shielded it. Internal organs showed massive hemorrhages, lungs and bronchi lined with a yellow film of poison. Death from mustard gas was slow and excruciating, 4 to 5 weeks of suffering before release came. Mustard gas was rightly called the most terrible chemical weapon of the First World War. At least 120,000 people were affected during the conflict. In the British Army alone, about 160,000 soldiers were gassed with mustard gas, over 4,000 fatally. Though its mortality rate was relatively low, 2 to 3%, since open-air concentrations were rarely lethal, its psychological effect was immense. Soldiers feared mustard gas more than any other. If chlorine warned you by smell, and phosgene killed quickly but invisibly, mustard gas was known as the creeping death. It poisoned slowly, crippled for months, and left scars both physical and mental. Germany used mustard gas during its 1917 offensives at Ypres and Cambrai, inflicting severe Allied losses. But within months, the Allies struck back. British chemists developed their own version, codenamed HS, hot stuff. By autumn 1918, Anglo-American forces were using mustard gas against the Germans on the Western Front. The United States, having entered the war in 1917, also embraced chemical warfare. In spring 1918, it created its own Army Chemical Service, built factories such as the Edgewood Arsenal, and mass-produced mustard gas and Phosgene. By the war's end, about 10% of all American artillery shells contained chemical charges. Thus, Germany's monopoly on chemical terror did not last long. By 1918, both sides were drenching each other in poison on nearly equal terms. However, the effect of the new poison did not last. As with chlorine in 1915, by 1918, mustard gas's advantage had begun to fade. The Allies had learned to partially counter it. There was no absolute protection against mustard blisters, but armies introduced strict rules. At the slightest suspicion of mustard gas, soldiers put on protective goggles, masks, and even special capes to shield the skin. The famous Scottish regiments in kilts, for example, had to give up their traditional dress. Bare legs were an easy target for mustard gas. Infantrymen learned that during a mustard gas attack, one should not hide in shell holes or dugouts. On the contrary, it was better to climb higher. The gas is heavier than air, so it settles in low places. Troops took up a new saying: if you want to survive a gas attack, get up on the parapet. And indeed, those who stayed on their feet during a gas alarm often got away with a light cough, while the wounded lying on the ground died of suffocation. Thus, the escalation of chemical warfare in 1915 to 1917 brought new, even more terrifying poisons, but it brought no decisive victory to either side. Gas became a routine tool of positional warfare, like the machine gun or the mortar had once done. By the middle of the war, troops had adapted to life under the chemical threat, and it is this adaptation that we now turn to. Gas masks and protection, the race against an invisible threat. Poison gas turned out to be a weapon for which a countermeasure could be found. The chief advantage of chemical weapons, suddenness and invisibility, proved also to be their weakness. Once aware of the danger, armies could develop protection, and they set about doing so immediately after the first gas strikes. In the very first days after the 1915 Ypres attack, simple instructions were sent to Entente soldiers. If gas appears, press a wet cloth to your mouth. That way at least some of the poison could be filtered. The Germans, still planning their own gas use, also took precautions for their troops. Before the 1915 attack at Ypres, German gas units were issued gauze pads soaked in a sodium bicarbonate solution to be held over the face. This gave a brief, limited effect. In this improvised race, everyone was inventing on the fly. British and French divisions, for example, stitched their own gauze masks soaked in soda solutions, using whatever materials were at hand: muslin, cotton, and even enlisted local French women to mass-produce face coverings. Within weeks, millions of primitive anti-gas masks had been sent to soldiers. Some, however, proved useless. Poorly moistened cotton could become a trap. Dry wadding didn't filter chlorine, and a man could suffocate inside his own mask. But overall, the first panic shock passed. Soldiers realized that protection was indeed possible. By the spring and summer of 1915, nearly all armies had fielded their first standardized gas masks. At first, these were simply improved cloth masks. The British Haldane respirator, or the black veil, a piece of chemically impregnated fabric with ties, was officially issued as early as May 1915. Soon came McPherson's smoke helmet, a bag made of dense flannel impregnated with sodium thiosulfate, hence the nickname hypo helmet. The hood covered the entire head, tied at the neck, and the eyes were protected by glass inserts. This was the first more or less reliable gas mask. It blocked chlorine and partly phosgene. Its drawbacks were real. The lenses fogged quickly, the fabric irritated the skin, and worst of all, in rain, the chemicals could run from the hood straight into a soldier's eyes. Even so, by July 1915, the entire British Army was equipped with such hoods. The Germans, who had entered the war without gas masks, issued special masks with cotton pads by the summer of 1915, and later rubber masks with filter canisters. By the summer of 1916, German gas masks were considered very good, featuring a comfortable rubber facepiece that sealed tightly and a replaceable chemical filter canister. The British did not lag behind. In the autumn of 1915, they introduced the improved P helmet, impregnated with phenol against Phosgene, and in January 1916, the HP helmet, with added hexamine for better neutralization. Still, all of these SAC types had a fundamental flaw. There was too little filtering medium, making breathing very difficult. One British officer recalled how, during the attack at Loos, men advanced in P helmets, feeling constant suffocation and misted lenses. It took a real act of will not to tear the hood from one's head. Many did just that, helping explain the relatively high British losses to their own gas at Loos. Technical ingenuity did not stop there. By 1916, box respirators, prototypes of the modern gas mask, appeared. These consisted of two parts, a tight-fitting face mask with rubber edges and glass eyepieces, and a corrugated hose connecting the mask to a filter box. The box contained activated charcoal and chemicals that neutralized the most common gases, for example, sodium thiosulfate against chlorine, hexamethylene tetramine against phosgene. At first, the boxes were quite bulky. The British large box respirator was worn on the back, and soldiers had to breathe through a separate mouthpiece while pinching the nose with a clip. This was inconvenient, so that model was left to the artillery, and a lighter infantry version was created, the small box respirator, SBR. This mask looked very much like a modern one, a compact metal filter box mounted at the front or side of the mask, which itself sealed closely to the face and was made of rubberized fabric. The 1917 SBR proved highly effective. Its filters could be updated as new gases appeared, and the eyepieces hardly fogged at all. The Americans adopted it when they arrived in France in 1918. Soldiers valued their new masks so much that during the chaotic retreats of spring 1918, when Britons even abandoned weapons, almost no one discarded a respirator. Men preferred to lose a rifle rather than be left without gas protection. The gas mask became as essential as the helmet or the rifle. Every soldier carried it at all times, either in a bag on the chest or perched on the forehead with the mask rolled up so it could be pulled down in a second at the alarm. Gradually, both sides developed the tactic of the gas barrage, saturating a given sector with rhythmic, continuous shelling so the enemy could not remain there. Night attacks were especially common. Everyone knew gas was heavier than air and collected in low ground during calm night air. Trenches, ravines, and small woods were shelled with gas in the evening to force the enemy either to withdraw or to sit all night in masks, exhausted. At first, the main agents in shells were chlorine and phosgene, but from 1917 onward, mustard gas was added as a long-lasting contaminant. The Germans even created a color-coded system for chemical shells: green cross for chlorine and phosgene, yellow cross for mustard gas, blue cross for irritants. In early July 1917, just days before the first mustard shelling, the Germans tried a new combination: blue cross shells filled with diphenylchloroarsenine, a compound that caused violent coughing and sneezing. The gas itself was not deadly, but its purpose was to make soldiers tear off their masks. When choking or vomiting, a man instinctively pulled his mask away. And that was when the real killer gas arrived. On July 10, 1917, The Germans used exactly this trick at Ypres, first firing Blue Cross sneezing gas shells at British positions, and as soon as troops tore off their masks, following up with Green Cross Phosgene. These mask breakers were a particularly insidious weapon. The Allies later responded in kind. In 1918, British artillery shelled German rear areas with DM gas, Adamsite, another Blue Cross agent that caused uncontrollable sneezing and tears, forcing the enemy out of cover. Gas bombardments were usually combined with conventional artillery fire. The goal of gas was to neutralize a point, for instance to silence an enemy battery, by hitting it with phosgene so the gunners fled or died, or to force infantry out of trenches on a ridge, by blanketing them with mustard gas so they burned and could no longer fight. The largest British gas cylinder attack took place on March 31, 1918, near Lens. 3,728 cylinders of chlorine, over 80 tons, were released at once. The gas engulfed the city, the German garrison panicked and withdrew, and the British occupied Lens almost without resistance. Gas could, at times, capture fortifications that would otherwise have cost thousands of lives to storm. In such cases, commanders cynically called it an economy of blood. Better, they said, to choke the enemy with poison than to lose men in an assault. Gas had become a standard tool of major operations by the war's end. The German spring offensive of 1918, Berlin's last desperate attempt to win, made wide use of the newest poisons. During its opening phase, Operation Michael, March 1918, the Germans acted shrewdly. Instead of attacking the British salient near Flesquieres head-on, they drenched it with mustard gas shells. Within hours, the trenches were saturated, and the British had to abandon the salient without a fight. The position was simply uninhabitable. The Germans thus straightened their line and eliminated a dangerous bulge without losing a single soldier. Command realized it was often more effective to drive the enemy out with gas than to send in infantry. The opposite example came during the Allies' 100 Days Offensive in the autumn of 1918. By then, the Entente had seized the initiative and was advancing along the entire front. The Allied armies now possessed vast quantities of chemical munitions, especially the Anglo-American forces. In one battle, the Battle of Amiens, August 1918, every third British artillery shell was chemical. Massive gas and artillery raids on German rear positions, bridges, and supply routes became routine. German veterans later recalled, "The Allies drowned us in mustard gas." Even the fortified Hindenburg Line, Germany's last major defensive barrier, was breached with the help of gas. In autumn 1918, American forces advancing through the Argonne Forest used a new weapon: flying gas capsules, FB, Mangolite, a type of chemical munition in which aircraft scattered thousands of small poison capsules over enemy trenches. This method, first employed in September 1918 during the breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line, combined artillery bombardment with aerial gas dispersal, completely disorganizing German defenses. Limits of gas warfare. Despite all its technical cunning, gas weapons had their limits. First, they depended heavily on the weather. Wind, rain, and frost could ruin a commander's plan. Second, once one side introduced a new gas, the other found a countermeasure or an equivalent within weeks or months. As soldiers joked, a new gas kills the enemy exactly once. After that, he adapts. Third, gas was an indiscriminate weapon. You couldn't control exactly where it would spread. In battle, this led to tragic-comic scenes. Sometimes the poison cloud suddenly drifted back on those who released it, or the wind shifted, and the suffocating curtain meant to cover an attack instead hindered the attackers. That's what happened at Ypres in June 1916, when the British attacked the Germans after a gas release. Unexpectedly, the wind died, and the chlorine hung in front of their own line, forcing the British themselves to struggle forward in gas masks and blinding their own artillery. Another limitation: after a gas attack, infantry assaults were very difficult, since advancing across freshly contaminated ground meant running into residual gas or knocking off one's own mask and being poisoned. For example, after a heavy mustard gas bombardment, it was impossible to send troops in quickly. You had to wait. In fast-moving operations, this was a disadvantage. Thus, it was later noted that in blitzkrieg, maneuver, mobile warfare, there was no place for chemical weapons. They slowed movement more than they helped. Psychological and moral impact of gas warfare. As is clear, poison gas had a colossal psychological effect. The First World War was hell enough for soldiers: machine gun killing fields, bayonet charges, artillery barrages. But nothing inspired such otherworldly fear as the sudden cry, "gas." One witness wrote that soldiers under gas fire suffered en masse from various nervous disorders, hysterical coughing, panic at any fog or smoke. Even those who had never been gassed spoke of nightmares, visions of being poisoned by a cloud, suffocating under a mask and unable to escape. Many soldiers after shell shock or trench shock fell into a state where any specific smell, even ordinary disinfectant chlorine or campfire smoke, triggered panic attacks. Doctors of the First World War began recording a new phenomenon: gas neuroses. As early as 1915, medics realized that some men showed symptoms of poisoning though they had not been exposed to any gas. It was pure stress, poisoning by fear. In one British unit, it was recorded that after the very first Ypres bombardment, 25% of soldiers reported psychosomatic complaints: headache, vomiting, cough, but no medical cause, no toxin in the blood was found. It was terror at work. The moral condemnation of chemical weapons is another matter. Even before the war, the civilized world had banned poisons as inhumane. After the first gas attacks in 1915, outrage peaked. Allied newspapers in particular strove to depict the barbarity of the Germans, who had violated international law. The Germans retorted that Britain itself had broken the rules first by using tear gas, though that was more casuistic. Yet the longer the war went on, the more hypocritical it became. From 1916, the Allies too were pouring poison on the enemy. Gas came to be accepted as a familiar evil. Still, its reputation as a dishonorable weapon persisted. Officers wrote in their journals that gas was coward's war. Where was the honor in shooting an enemy who was already choking? Particularly galling was that gas killed slowly and painfully, unlike a bullet. In 1918, the International Committee of the Red Cross issued an open letter condemning gas as a barbarous invention which science has brought to perfection. The document urged governments to renounce chemical weapons as devices that turn soldiers into guinea pigs, condemning them to unbearable suffering. One British Army lieutenant wrote after the war, "From a bullet, death is instant or a few hours, but from gas you burn up inside for weeks and only pray for it to end." The poet-soldier Wilfred Owen immortalized a gas attack in his lines, "Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling. He plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning." His poem Dulce et decorum est became his generation's emotional response to the horrors of gas warfare. Owen described a man dying from Phosgene. "If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, you would never again repeat the old lie that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Chemical war also affected civilians. Formally, all belligerents promised not to use gas against towns and villages, but poison knows no front line. Winds often carried clouds into nearby settlements. Villages near the front in France and Belgium suffered especially. The French command even developed special measures. Before a gas attack, they would warn the local authorities opposite so they could evacuate residents or issue masks. From 1916, the British also began issuing gas masks to civilian workers in the forward zone. Ultimately, the order was everyone within 8 kilometers of the front must carry a respirator at all times. Even so, disasters could not be avoided. The city of Armentières in northern France suffered the worst. In July 1917, during intense German mustard gas bombardment, the poison seeped into basements, homes, even sewers. People hid wherever they could, yet 675 civilians were gassed and 86 died. And this despite shelters and issued masks. Mustard gas crept in unseen, stealing into the town itself. Over the course of the war, official figures say that on the Western Front, about 1,325 civilians were affected by German chemical attacks, with over 100 deaths. These numbers are surely understated. Minor incidents were not counted, and Germany's statistics on its civilians gassed by the Allies are unknown, though incidents occurred, for example in Alsace and the Balkans. Chemical plants were hazardous too. During production and filling of munitions, there were leaks and accidents. In France, Britain, and the USA, around 4,000 chemical plant workers suffered poisonings and accidents, some fatal. In Germany, there are no official figures, but serious incidents and deaths are known at BASF factories producing mustard gas. Government censors tried to conceal civilian gas losses, fearing this would sap national morale. Thus, the British press hardly reported civilian deaths from German gas shelling until after the war. Even so, it became obvious chemical weapons spill beyond the battlefield and threaten everyone. This played a part in the post-war revulsion toward gas. The world began to lean toward a simple conclusion: such weapons should be banned forever. 1917 to 1918, the apex of chemical war. The last 2 years of the Great War marked the peak of chemical weapons use. 1917 saw the advent of mustard gas and record Allied gas casualties. 1918 was the year when both Germany and the Entente unleashed the greatest volume of poison of the entire war. By some estimates, in 1918, up to 30% of all shells expended at the front were chemical. Battles were increasingly saturated with gas. In some sectors, virtually every artillery preparation began with several salvos of chemical shells to drive the enemy from forward positions or force him to hide under masks. Germany, sensing strategic decline, tried to play its chemical trump card. During the spring offensive of 1918, the Germans employed all types of gases on an unprecedented scale. In addition to the mustard gas bombardment of the Flesquières salient mentioned above, a mass of gas attacks crashed down on British and French forces all along the front. On 21 March 1918, the very first day of the offensive, the Germans fired far more gas shells at the positions of the British Fifth Army than ever before. Every British battery, every command post in depth received Phosgene gifts. As eyewitnesses recalled, British defense could not coordinate properly. Rear area officers coughing up blood transmitted their final orders and then died. Telephone operators in masks could not hear on the line. Gun crews were knocked out. Germans wrote that gas had blunted the teeth of British artillery, breaking their defense. This was true to a degree. Operation Michael nearly ended in catastrophe for Britain, whose army fell back west under enemy pressure. But, as we now understand, it was also a Pyrrhic victory for Germany. Advancing Kaiserheer units moved into areas only just drenched with phosgene and mustard gas. However good the German respirators were, attacking in them was no pleasure. Men straggled, pulled off masks, and fell victim to the poison. Though final statistics are lacking, experts have calculated that German gas losses in spring 1918 were no less than those of the Allies. The paradox: the attacking side suffered from its own gas as well. As they withdrew, the British saturated abandoned villages with gas shells, so Germans entered mustard-soaked settlements where chemical booby traps awaited them. For example, a gas surprise, a bucket of bleaching powder with a vial of hydrochloric acid rigged to break when a door opened, filling the room with chlorine. The upshot: both sides suffered from poison, but neither gained decisive advantage. Summer 1918, the last gasp of gas war. By now, Germany was clearly exhausting itself, while the Entente was growing stronger thanks to the Americans. Yet the chemical troops kept striking as if unaware the end was near. In July 1918, the Germans launched their final attack on the Western Front, the Second Battle of the Marne. During this offensive, the Battle of Reims, German batteries fired tens of thousands of gas shells aiming at French reserves coming up from the south. The result? Several French divisions, permeated with Phosgene, were unable to take part. But this did not save the Germans from defeat. The Entente had ample reserves, even without those choking in the rear. Nor were German troops what they had been at the start of the war. Gas no longer intimidated them. Nearly every German soldier knew the gas mask would save him, and even when counterattacked by American and French forces on the Marne, the Germans maintained discipline and withdrew in an orderly fashion, despite the enemy drenching them with poison. The war's final months were a nightmare for the infantry. Artillery on both sides fired incessantly, mixing high explosive and gas shells. Gas casualties reached their peak. Historians estimate that during 1918, roughly one-third of all battle casualties in some armies were chemical. In the American Expeditionary Forces, of approximately 225,000 battle casualties, over 70,000 were due to gas, 31%, yet only 1,221 died, about 1.7%. The lesson is clear. Gas maimed and incapacitated on a massive scale, but killed comparatively few. In the British Army, nearly 180,000 chemical casualties were recorded in 1918, 9 times the 1915 figure, but the fatality rate again remained below 3%. Medical services learned to treat gas cases better, masks protected most, and many poisoned soldiers returned to duty. Setting aside the long-term consequences, which were real, thousands of young veterans lived out their years with damaged lungs, blindness, and skin diseases. On 11 November 1918, the guns fell silent. The World War was over. To sum up, over 4 years of conflict, about 125,000 tons of chemical agents were used in warfare. By various estimates, 1.0 to 1.3 million soldiers suffered chemical injuries. Of these, roughly 90,000 to 100,000 died, less than 5% of all those poisoned, and only about 3% of total combat deaths in the First World War. Thus, for all its demonic image, chemical weaponry killed far fewer people than artillery, which accounted for about 60% of war deaths. Nevertheless, the fog of death changed the face of war forever. It made trench life even more unbearable. Beyond bullets and shells, men in the trenches now feared the very air they breathed. Gas attacks rarely decided battles, but almost always sowed panic, delay, and chaos. No wonder gas was called a weapon of terror. It affected minds more than strategy. It was a weapon of intimidation and attrition, and as such it worked. Soldiers dubbed the Great War a chemist's war, for both high explosives and gases served the industrial destruction of human beings. The lessons were obvious. Chemical weapons brought no decisive success to either side. They merely added a new dimension of suffering and forced vast effort to defend against them. In November 1918, victors and vanquished alike breathed a qualified sigh of relief. Enough. In 1925, the League of Nations adopted the Geneva Protocol, banning the use of poisonous gases in war. The major powers, France, Britain, Germany, the USSR, and the USA, signed it, with the reservation, unless used against us, just in case. Stockpiles were still amassed in the interwar years in preparation for possible revanche. And they were used, alas. In the 1930s, Italy dropped mustard gas from aircraft on Ethiopian villages. Japan gassed Chinese troops. In the Second World War, chemical weapons were fortunately not used on Europe's battlefields. A grim parody and fear of mutual poisoning stayed Hitler and the Allies' hands. The Nazis did use gas for the mass murder of civilians. In concentration camps, gas chambers were used to kill millions of defenseless people, perfecting science's barbarous invention for maximal evil. Thus, the fog of death did not vanish. It reappeared from time to time in 20th century conflicts. Chemical attacks occurred after the First World War, in Vietnam, in the Iran-Iraq War, and more recently, in the Syrian Civil War. But the memory of the Great War, of those stifling trenches of Flanders and Poland where men went mad as they donned their masks, still restrains humanity from mass use of poison. Military historians are unanimous. Chemical weapons in the First World War, despite the initial shock effect, gave no strategic advantage to either side. They merely added cruelty and suffering that might otherwise have been avoided. Soldiers learned to defend against them, but the very fact that men were forced to go like fish with air cylinders on their backs and rubber masks speaks volumes about the degradation of the idea of an honorable fight. Hence, the continuing taboo on toxic agents as weapons that make war excessively inhuman. Epilogue. In the midst of the Second Battle of Ypres, the German staff prepared a press release cynically calling the chlorine attack a new stage of warfare that will substantially reduce suffering by inflicting crushing losses on the enemy. Reality proved the opposite. Suffering only multiplied, and decisive victory never came. Chemical weapons changed the face of the First World War, but could not decide its outcome. War swallowed both the chemists and their deadly creations, drowning Europe in mud and blood by old methods, artillery, tanks, and sheer numbers of men. Yet the image of a soldier in a gas mask, amid trenches soaked in yellow fumes, became the war's most terrifying symbol. The artist John Sargent painted Gassed, a line of blind, gas-burned soldiers holding on to one another, stumbling toward the dressing station beneath a dying Flemish sky. That ghastly Way of the Cross is a warning to every later generation. Humanity learned that science can not only ease life, but also bring refined death. And perhaps for the first time, it felt ashamed of its own progress. The fog of death dispersed, but the bitter aftertaste remains forever. Sources. This script is based on historical data and accounts, including military historians estimate total chemical casualties in the First World War at 1.3 million, with approximately 90,000 deaths. The first mass chlorine use occurred at Ypres on April 22, 1915, when the Germans released 680 tons of chlorine, causing up to 5,000 Allied deaths. Gas attacks on the Eastern Front began in January 1915 at Bolimov, including the tragedy of the Attack of the Dead Men at Osowiec in August 1915. The Allies replied with gas at Loos in 1915, but wind partly blew the gas back onto British positions. In December 1915, the Germans first used Phosgene, 6 times deadlier than chlorine, which ultimately caused most chemical deaths of the war. Mustard gas, or Epert, introduced in 1917, caused mass injuries, up to 120,000 affected, with a relatively low fatality rate, but became the most terrifying weapon psychologically. In 1917 to 1918, chemical attacks reached their height. For example, Germany's spring offensive of 1918 featured massive mustard use, and by autumn 1918, the Allies were conducting more gas attacks than the Germans. Contemporary observers condemned gas as a barbaric method, and the international community banned it under the 1925 Geneva Protocol.